Welcome to Forum 360. I'm Ardith Keck, your host today. Cuba's been in the news a lot lately, so we're going to talk about Cuba. With me is Dr. William Keck, Professor Emeritus of Family and Community Medicine at the Northeast Ohio Medical University. Dr. Keck is also Vice Chair of the Board of Directors of Medical Education Cooperation with Cuba, or MEDICC, MEDICC for short, and has written and lectured about the nature of Cuba's national health system. Full disclosure, Dr. Keck is my husband. He has traveled to Cuba more than 30 times, and I have been there 20 times. So while he is the expert on health care in Cuba, I speak Spanish, and a lot of Cubans want to practice their English. So I've been able to talk to the average citizen about their life there. We're both going to contribute to those conversations. First, though, let's talk about health care. Bill, what is it about the Cuban health system that makes studying it worthwhile for communities in the U.S.?
Well, I think the most interesting thing about Cuba is that they have managed to actually develop a national health system that's very effective and very efficient. Cuba is a middle-income country. We would think of it as a poor country, certainly a low-resource country, yet they've managed to create a healthier population than we have, actually, in many ways. Their life expectancy is about the same. Their infant mortality rate is much lower than ours. Other health statistics indicate the same sort of thing. They're doing quite well, and so most people don't expect anything good to come out of Cuba in the United States. We've been conditioned to believe that, but they actually have accomplished something. And given our own efforts now at health reform and our own awareness that we do not do well in the world, that is, if you compare us to other countries like us, that is rich countries, we're near the bottom of the list when it comes to our health status here. So it seems to make intuitive sense, at the beginning at least, to take a look at what Cubans are doing to see how they manage to accomplish what they have.
So what are they doing?
Well, I think the center part of it is they decided early on that they were going to have a system that is free to the individual. So
totally free.
Totally free, yes, certainly for the basic services. Occasionally you'll need to buy a little medicine on the side perhaps, but the basic services are free to the individual, and everybody has access to a doctor. They've managed to create more than 11,000 doctor and nurse teams, they call family doctor teams, that are scattered across the country, and essentially every Cuban has easy access to primary care that is preventively oriented.
How does the Cuban life expectancy compare to ours?
It's about the same. It's about the same. It's in the high 70s, 79, 78 for average. Women a little higher, and 80s, men a little bit lower. But it's just about the same as ours.
Isn't that rather surprising, considering that they're a poor country, as you said?
Yes, it's one of the best records in the world, certainly for a country with their economic status. It's certainly the best in Central South America, the Caribbean, Africa, and much of Asia. It's really quite remarkable.
So what can we learn from Cuba?
Well, first, sort of, how do they do this? What are the lessons? First, access to primary care for everybody is clearly important. We know that, and we haven't achieved that in our country yet.
But they have access is by virtue of a nurse and doctor team.
Yes, they do. And that doctor is actually responsible for the health status of a population. So the doctors serve specific geographic populations, neighborhoods in big cities or larger areas in small towns or rural areas. And they are expected to improve the health status of the whole population. It's a different approach. I was trained to do battle with disease, one patient at a time. They certainly do fairly well at clinical care, obviously, but they also are focused on prevention. So they will do their best to see every person that they have in their catchment area about twice a year, assuming they're well. If they're ill, of course, they'll see them more often. And that means they track not only the illnesses these folks have, but what their risks to health are. And so they take all this information and put it together into a community diagnosis, if you will, a description of health status in the population they're responsible for. And they update that every 6 months. And based on that, they then may design specific population interventions to try to improve problems that they may identify.
You said that they have to see each person twice a year.
Yeah.
I assume that means once in the office and the other one is at home?
At home, right. Generally, these family doctor and nurse teams have office hours about half the day, and the other half the day they're out in the community and making house visits, also looking at restaurants. They do a lot of public health things that other professionals tend to do in the United States. And it's probably worth mentioning that they have access to specialty care as well. All right.
That was my next question.
Yes. So for about every 40 to 70 of these family doctor and nurse offices, there's a thing called a polyclinic, which is really a multi-specialty group practice. And that's where the internists, the pediatricians, and the surgeons, and the obstetrician gynecologists, and the psychiatrists are, and so on. And so those polyclinics then support the family doctor and nurse. So if they have a patient with a complication or more complicated illness than they feel comfortable taking care of themselves, they can refer to the polyclinic. And the polyclinic then sends around teams of specialists to visit each family doctor office on a regular rotation as well. So you can have sort of in your office consultation with a specialist if that's required. And it's an effort to try to treat as much illness as possible at the local level because it's less expensive.
And their hospitals do all kinds of things. They actually do transplants and...
Yes, some of the specialist hospitals do. Cuba's about the size of the U.S. in terms of land mass and population, shaped a lot differently, of course. But I'm sorry, not the U.S., but Ohio, about the same as Ohio. And they've got over 250 hospitals now, most of them general hospitals, but then special hospitals as well, OB/GYN hospitals, infectious disease hospitals, transplant areas, specializations in heart disease, and so on. So if you're unfortunate enough to be an interesting case, then there is a place that you can go. And care is coordinated, of course, by the family doctor. And those hospitals are connected to the health professions education institutions, the medical schools, nursing schools, dental schools, and so on. So students and doctors in training are involved in this whole hierarchy of services from primary care to secondary, even tertiary care.
Has the embargo affected Cuba's ability to get medicine?
Very much so. It's one of the major impacts of the embargo, and of course the embargo is still in place despite the recent changes. So, the embargo really precludes Cuba from purchasing anything, raw materials or finished products, be they medical equipment or drugs, from any company that's wholly or partially owned by a United States company. And so it makes it very difficult for them, particularly since that 20 years ago or so, many, particularly pharmaceutical companies in the United States, bought up a lot of companies around the world. So Cuba's sources for medicines outside of its own ability to produce them is increasingly limited as time goes by.
What they do?
Well, what they do is first, perhaps the silver lining of the embargo for them is that they've been forced to create their own biotechnical capacity. So now they make about 80% of the drugs they need and consume. They still have to import some, and for that they have searched the world over for ways to do it. But that, of course, drives up the cost, if they can get them at all. So there are some drugs available only in the U.S. that they just can't get, at least not legally.
All right, we're talking today about Cuba, and I'm Ardith Keck, and welcome to Forum 360. Dr. Keck is my husband, and we're talking together about Cuba because both of us have been there so many times. There is a very unusual medical school in Cuba, and I want you to tell us briefly about that.
Sure. I'm sure you're referring to the Latin American medical school, so-called the Escuela Latinoamericana, or ELAM, as they call it. Cuba, remember, is about the size of Ohio. It's got 23 medical schools, and then they've added this one. What they did
in Ohio have 4?
About 7.
7.
Mm-hmm. So Cuba has been involved for quite a while in trying to help its poor neighbors, and that's now a very broad term because it involves Central, South America, Africa, and Asia principally, in meeting the healthcare needs of their populations. And they said the world is short of trained health professionals, and they felt a responsibility to try to help to ameliorate that condition. So they turned their Naval Academy into a medical school, which is the largest medical school in the world, capable of handling up to 2,000 students per class, and they take only students from other countries. So they essentially import these physicians, train them for free, because there is no tuition cost in Cuba. Just as health services are free to the population, so is education. Something that will make a lot of U.S. students pretty jealous, I think.
We'll talk more about that, but go ahead.
Yes, so they are heavily engaged now in training physicians for the rest of the world, particularly the developing world, although there are a couple hundred, more than 200 Americans who have or currently are taking advantage of that opportunity as well.
And the students then promise to go back to their country, or do they stay in Cuba?
No. Well, they get this education in return for a pledge to serve underserved populations, to go where they are needed, in other words, is the way they tend to put it. It doesn't necessarily have to be back in their own country. Some choose to go to other countries, but the whole idea is to go back and use this free education for the betterment of those who, by and large, are excluded from health care in one way or another. And
the biggest surprise of all is the fact that there are American students.
Yes, well, that may be a surprise to Americans. It's interesting. Yes, these are students, mostly minority students, black and Hispanic, not entirely, but mostly, who are well qualified for medical school but just can't afford it, and who have a sense that they want to give back to the community. So there is a process, it's too complicated to go into here, but there is a process by which students like that can apply. And if they are successful in their application, then they'll get 6 years of medical education, so far at least, free of tuition. They'll get room and board and a very small stipend as well. It's really quite remarkable. It's a gift of Cuba so far of at least $45 to $50 million to the United States, the country that is embargoing them.
And some of these students have come back and have done fine?
Yes.
I mean, the education in Cuba is okay?
The education's quite good, actually. The medical education's quite good. These students do have to come back and pass U.S. boards. The organization I work with helps with some of that to help prepare them for boards. But yes, they come back, pass the boards, and many of them now are in residencies, and some are actually now out in practice here.
That in itself tells me something about the fact that what we're talking about is true. but there is better authentication for the doubting Thomases out there.
Yes, well, in terms of health stats, the Pan American Health Organization and the World Health Organization have paid close attention to Cuba. They have employees who work in Cuba, they have offices in Cuba, and they have verified this data. The Cubans measure everything and are quite open about their shortcomings. So the data they produce is real, it is believable. As a matter of fact, WHO is entranced enough with some of Cuba's accomplishments that there are at least 3 or 4 specialty offices in Cuba now working on things like dengue fever, where they are specialists and are focusing on how to control that disease, and 2 or 3 others through WHO specialist offices there.
Okay, let's move on to education. You mentioned that education is free in Cuba, and that probably blows the mind of most of the listeners out there. How do they do that?
Well, you have to understand that this is a priority for the Cuban Revolution. I will tell you, they promised health and education, and they've delivered on both of these. And they say it is the responsibility of their governments, responsibility of the state, to enhance the capacity of its population in these ways. So, indeed, they are very focused on this. And it's a government priority, so a large portion of their budget goes to that. The military portion of their budget now is very small, and much of that has been redirected towards these health and education efforts.
So if you can pass the test to get into a school, medical school,
engineering, whatever it might be,
then you can become an engineer,
Yes.
and of course stay there for the entire time and do well. Cubans are friendly towards Americans, and they're happy to talk with Americans. When you or I or anybody else talks with them, they're very happy to share their life and how things are. Times are changing, and now because there are so many Americans going to Cuba,
or wishing to go,
it's hard to find a hotel room. Has the embargo been lifted?
No, as I mentioned earlier, the embargo is still in place. President Obama has done about as much as I think he legally can in terms of changing our relationship with Cuba, but he does not have the authority to lift the embargo. That authority rests directly with Congress. And so the embargo is still in place. None of the rules about purchase or sales of materials between the 2 countries have changed.
So we're still not able to go, just hop on a plane with our passport and go.
That's correct. The categories of Americans who can travel to Cuba has expanded now up to 12 different categories. But you still have to fit in that. You still have to have an organized agenda that focuses on whatever your particular interest is, for which travel is allowed, and so on. So it means there are more groups going, but they tend to be, they must be focused to some degree, and you can't just go there and wander around and as an American, legally. Now, certainly Americans do go there illegally, and of course they have tourists from all over the world who go there and have free run of the country, essentially.
Of course, that's getting harder since there are fewer hotel rooms.
Well, yes, and certainly as travel ramps up, it does create a difficulty there, and I'm sure if this holds, that it will spur development, perhaps positive, perhaps not so positive in some parts of Cuba.
If health care and education and maybe even some parts of daily life are so good in Cuba, why are they hopping on a boat to come to the U.S.?
Well, certainly some are, and these are mostly economic refugees and some few political refugees, but it's mostly economic refugees. Life is difficult in Cuba. The economy is restricted. It's a very socialized approach, and that covers most sectors except now perhaps restaurants, where it's lightening up a bit. And so you can be well trained, but the jobs outside of the tourist industry are comparatively low paying. So if you really want to have the material goods that we're used to having, then it's very difficult to get them in Cuba. Now, there's some in Cuba doing very well, of course, but that's a small minority, and they're the ones that tend to be involved in the tourist industry, running their own restaurants and so on.
As a matter of fact, there are doctors and engineers that I've run into who are selling crafts in the market and also driving taxis, because that's part of the tourist industry, and it makes sense for them that they can't earn as much in their own profession.
That's correct. So some of them are doing that as well as their profession or instead of their profession. There's a mixture. There are not many, but there clearly are some, and it's an indication that one reason Cuba can afford this concentration of professionals. I mean, they have the highest doctor-to-patient ratio of almost anywhere in the world. And one reason they can afford it, of course, is because salaries are comparatively low. So it doesn't cost them nearly what it would cost us to put a physician and nurse in a particular setting.
Salaries are so low that I think most Americans probably have no concept of that. We're not sure exactly of the amount now because times change.
Yes, there's been a raise.
But just about everybody is under $100 a month in pay, in salary coming from the Cuban government. Human rights. We're talking about all kinds of good things about Cuba, and people out there would say, well, what about human rights? That they don't have a good record. And I think that's something that we're not going to talk about because we don't know much about it. We do talk to Cubans about it, and we do have some sense of what's going on, but that's not a topic we're familiar with.
Well, not in the same detail, although the Cubans will tell you that their health system is based on human rights. That is, the right of access to health care. So they will easily talk about how important that is. The real question comes in the political area. There's more democracy in Cuba than most people realize, certainly at the neighborhood and state level. But yes, there are political prisoners in Cuba, and of course others would argue there are political prisoners in the U.S. as well. And of course, the Cubans point back to us and say, well, you've got the highest proportion of incarceration of your population of any country in the world. What are you doing about reasonable human rights? So the discussion goes on. And of course, a lot of that, I'm sure, is what's being discussed now as the details related to improving relations between the two continue, now that the negotiations related to opening embassies in each country have completed, and embassies are now open. Cuban embassy in Washington, a U.S. embassy in Havana. There's still a lot on the table from each side about what they would like to see happen in the other country in order for relationships to improve. So I think we've had a relatively stagnant process for more than 50 years with this embargo that hasn't changed much in Cuba that it was intended to from our perspective. But we've now had a flurry of activity and a warming of relations, and we'll just have to see what happens next. Eventually, if we're going to lift the embargo and really intermix as countries, that is, treat each other as equal trading partners, then Congress is going to have to act. And that's probably not going to happen in the near future.
Probably not, although businesses are anxious to get into
There's
Cuba.
Growing pressure from both the left and the right politically to open Cuba, although that pressure isn't universal, of course. So we'll see. There have been some chinks in the embargo before. American chicken is sold, and some grains and so on, but it's just the beginning.
Right, right. Well, I hope that our audience has learned something about Cuba and feels that it might be interesting to go there one day, perhaps. Thank you, Dr. Keck. Thank you, Bill, for talking with me. This is Ardith Keck for Forum 360.
Forum 360 is brought to you with support from Electric Impulse Communications, Kim and Harvey Nelson, Rubber City Radio Group, Akronist.com, AkronBuzz.com, Medical Mutual of Ohio, Forum 360 supporters, and the Shaw Jewish Community Center of Akron.